message ends and where another one begins. Next we have noisy browsers, right? So you have content coming from all over different places, favorite icons, headers, all sorts of different stuff. So it's really hard to see through that noise, and you have to figure out ways to kind of dull down that noise.
And it comes through multiple sockets as well.
Right. And then next you have no referring URLs once the user leaves HTTPS. So there's no way once they're out to tell where they came from, which makes it really difficult. And then lastly, there's no way to inject content or commands, supposedly, because of the integrity requirement. And that means that we can only mount an attack through observation. We can't really do stuff to that message.
Or you're not supposed to be able to anyway.
Yeah. So the initial idea for this presentation was that we were going to do this passive inference of data through man-in-the-middle, and Robert and I are talking, and we're like, hey, this is a really cool topic, right? And then they came out with this paper, and it's a fantastic paper. I encourage everybody to read it. But Robert and I ended up going drinking, crying into our beers, and finally we decided, okay, they took it pretty far, but we can take this a little bit further. They didn't talk about some of the ways that you can restrict those channels and make things more visible as a man in the middle.
And by the way, their math is incredible, way beyond what I would have done anyway, so they did a great job.
Hopefully you have a lot of time when you read this paper. So basically these guys postulated that you could look at the size difference in HTTPS traffic in order to determine what data was initiated by the user or the server, if requests were timed or not. And they did a whole bunch of experiments. They used a healthcare site, and they basically mapped out the healthcare site, and they decided that you're able to actually determine what medicine a person is taking, or what procedures they're doing, or what doctor types they're visiting, just by this inference attack, by looking at the size of the packets and the number of packets going across the wire. In attack site, they were able to look at income and medical bills and things like that, and then they look at an investment site, and they're actually able to look at privacy information, things like that. So we ended up changing our presentation to include some of this stuff and a whole bunch of other techniques, which we're going to talk about here in a sec. So basically what I did here is we created a page in the browser, and we can send it a number and say, I want to send a GET request of this size. And we had a similar page for post sizes. And then I used Wireshark to record that information and then create a Perl script that would actually parse through that information, determine the timing, which we then mapped into an Excel spreadsheet and came up with these pretty graphs.
It's important to note that the post is sending a bunch of data, whereas GET is receiving a lot of data in our examples.
So in this particular example, we have a GET request. It was 100,000 bytes. And you can see here, first off, you can see it's kind of spiky, right? And you can see that in this case, the ingress traffic is more than the egress traffic. So like Robert said, because the ingress is higher, you're actually able to determine it's a GET request because you're getting information, right? So basically we compared the number of packets inbound versus outbound over time. You get a nice pretty graph like this. Now if you look at the post request, it actually comes up very different. So in this case, right, we're posting data, we're actually sending data out there. So you can see here the egress is actually bigger than the ingress. And so when you look at that, you're able to tell, is somebody sending data or somebody receiving data? There's a slight difference on these graphs, and it's possible that it had to do, we were testing on an asynchronous DSL connection, so upload to the server is probably faster than the download. So that might explain some of the differences there. But you can definitely tell the difference between post and GET just by looking at the size of the packets. So here what we did is we actually mapped out the packets by size. This is the total number of packets. It's from 10,000 bytes all the way up to 100,000 bytes. And the first thing you notice here is there's more ingress than egress, right? So this is a GET request. We can tell that automatically just looking at this guy. And then you can see that there's a real nice diagonal line there, which means that we can predict with relative accuracy the request size by the number of packets. So automatically you can infer how big the request was just by looking at the number of packets going back and forth from the browser to the server.
And the variance is due to the jitter in SSL and TLS, the extra padding.
Now this also works for smaller requests. So I mapped out from 1,000 bytes up to 10,000, and it's not quite as clear ingress versus egress at this level. You have to do some of the looking at the timing of these things in order to figure that out. But there's definitely still a nice diagonal line, and you can see, if I'm at 10 packets, then it's probably closer to the 1,000 level. Or if it's closer to 20, then we're probably pushing on 100,000. So it's fairly or 10,000. It's fairly easy just to look at the number of packets in order to determine the size of the actual request. And we can infer this down to the 1,000K range. If you did some packet analysis with more optimizations, then it may be possible to get this down even further. This is just the raw data. Let's look at what comes back and forth. So with some of the other techniques that we're going to talk about, you can probably get this down even below that 1,000 level. And then here we have time-based requests. So the idea here is that we can also look at things like JavaScript, asynchronous requests, stuff that's going on in your background. We can look at those, and you can see a nice pretty graph where every 10 seconds on here we get a little spike, and that we can tell that there's stuff going on in the background there that are these timing requests.
So that that might be very interesting, or it might be really uninteresting. It might be a banner ad and I don't care, or it might be something like an AJAX request sending or submitting data or whatever, and that might be incredibly important. That might be the only thing I'm interested in. So by a series of subtraction, we're now looking at the exact things that we're interested in or not interested in, and getting rid of the chaff, sort of.
Yeah. If on a particular site you have one page that actually has this type of data on it, well, now you know they're on that page, right?
Yeah, you can map out where they are specifically on which part of the domain. So this really kind of comes down to, can you map this out ahead of time? If you can map out the domain ahead of time, you get a ton of advantages as an attacker. So let's say it's like a YouTube site or something. YouTube's a horrible example. A bank, where I might be able to have a bank account or something, get an example, where I can go through and actually check every single page, see what they are, see what the size bytes, see what sort of requests they typically make in the browser, and so on. If I know that ahead of time, then I can really dramatically reduce the likelihood of my not knowing where they are on the site, which gives me some significant advantages. So one thing is, can you force the user to prefetch the content? So if it's something that's cacheable content like images, CSS, JavaScript, that's not particularly helpful to know where they are on the site, then it's great. I can create a little iframe and a side channel, think about it like a separate tab or something. That separate tab, I can iframe in this exact same site or the exact same objects or whatever, and you're downloading them into your browser, and they're being cached. So that data will not be requested again, or a much smaller chunk will be requested instead of the gigantic size. Or I might not want to cache it at all in the case where it's a very specific size. So if it's an image and it's exactly 51,000 bytes or something, like a kind of a weird number, well, that's great. Then I know when I see something coming across the wire that's around 51,000 bytes, well, you probably are on that exact page with that one piece of content. So it depends a little bit on what the site looks like. One of the most important things is to figure out how did they get there and how did they leave, because that gives you two pieces of a puzzle. So let's say they visited 10 pages. Well, if you know the first and you know the last, now you only have to figure out 8 more pages. One thing you can do is figure out, okay, well, if they were on bank.com and they're about to click a button that says HTTPS bank.com, well, you know that they're landing on the homepage of that bank. If they're leaving the domain and they go to some site that they're clicking off, you say thank you for your order, click here to go to somewhere else, or whatever, screw off, go somewhere else. Well, if you know that that link only exists in one place in that site, you've now reduced that total likelihood of unknowns to the stuff in the middle. Known HTTP headers and SSL headers are really valuable. So I can force the user to come to my SSL TLS enabled website and basically figure out what HTTP headers they're going to send, what sort of encoding they're going to use, and so on, to dramatically reduce the amount of stuff I need to look at. I know exactly what the byte size is. I know exactly what I'm looking at, and so on. Also, DNS queries and host headers are all in plain text. I don't think a lot of people realize that when you're making an SSL TLS handshake, it's sending the host header in there. So just man in the middle, I can just watch and see what host you're visiting. That kind of leaks a little information, but also embedded third-party objects. So if there's an image that's hosted by Akamai or something as a static dot whatever, a lot of big websites use those, for instance. If it's only certain things hosted in certain websites, I can kind of tell where you are on the site website as you traverse through it, because I can see you pulling that third-party content as you're traversing the website. And of course, if they're not encrypted content over SSL, then I can either win in the case of JavaScript, CSS, where I can actually change the DOM, or if it's an image tags, at least I know where you are. You know, I can tell exactly where you are and what you've downloaded and so on. So a lot of these techniques, not all, but a lot of them rely on an asynchronous tab. So you have, let's say Firefox for instance, you have a tab sitting there that's over HTTP. A man in the middle can completely change the DOM, do whatever they want. They've got complete control over it. And a separate one that's in focus, the one that the user's actually interacting with, that's the SSL TLS enabled website. So users often surf like this. They don't realize that, you know, the attacker is still in control of their browser just because they don't see that happening in the background. So one thing you can do is do SSL timing based on pre-cached images. Figure out how long it takes them to render something. So Chris Evans had a great write-up on this, guy from Google. He basically said if you have a bunch of images, you know, let's say an image, and you make a bunch of requests to it over and over again, well, if the first time was really fast, and it's comparatively always fast, well, then you know that they visited before. But if the first time is slow and the next bunch of times are really fast, then you know they haven't been there before. So you can sort of figure out where they've been on the site as you want to check that question. You can also use cross-site request forgery on most sites to log people out, which is kind of not interesting. I'll show you why it's more interesting later. But being able to do cross-site request forgery and force someone out of their flow and back into login, if I kind of lost where they were as they were traversing through the site, I can force them to log out and get them back to login page. So it's a known state, I know where they are, and then as they traverse out again, I can sort of get control back and figure out where they're going. The %-- and security equals are things you can do inside iframe. So if I have bank.com %-- you know, slash %-, that's kind of not really solid URL encoding. So the web server will barf and say, I'm sorry, I don't know what you're talking about. Well, in that case, you're sending HTTP headers, you're sending cookies, you know, you're sending the GET request and so on. So I can kind of reduce all this stuff in the middle. Like I know that this is what's coming across the wire. I know exactly how big the response is going to be and coming back from a 400 response. If I use security equals restricted, I'm not sending cookies. I'm also not rendering JavaScript or objects or whatever. So I can kind of get multiple states. If I use an iframe with the %-, and an iframe with security restricted, I get 3 states of sort of the same web page, which can give me a lot of inference about what's going on there. These are really minor issues in NoScript. I kind of debated not even talking about them, but they are a lot of people use NoScript, so I figured it was worth talking about. But NoScript sets these cookies, which was totally destroying some of my tests. It sets these cookies pop under with a capital P and lowercase p. And actually, I think it sets like 2 or 3 more now. It's actually been increasing, so that needs to go away. But it only sets it on HTTP land and only when JavaScript is enabled. So you can't. It's not like it sends it on the server. But if you actually ask the DOM, you know, tell me what the cookies are, it'll show this pop under and a couple others. But they survive deletion. You can't get rid of them. So if I'm a man in the middle and I ask, do you have pop under and pop under, then I know that you've got NoScript. And more importantly, I know that JavaScript is enabled on the HTTPS site because there's really no separation between the HTTP and HTTPS versions of that site as far as NoScript is concerned. It's that once you enable, by default, you can actually change this, but by default it'll enable it in both HTTPS and HTTP. So even though the user is thinking I'm only enabling on the HTTPS site, they're actually enabling it for the bad guy on the HTTP version of that same website. So in the side channel they've got control of that and they can start interacting with the browser and so on. Like I said, pretty minor issues. It also doesn't respect ports, which is somewhat useful in a later example. So there's a bunch of different things you can potentially do to try to figure out what the history of that user is as they're going through that flow. One that totally doesn't work is using document.refer in JavaScript space. That'd be nice, but it doesn't work. You can use CSS history, but this does, if you use the typical examples, you actually have to refresh and reload the page over and over, which you know, in certain browsers makes clicking sounds and so on. There might be a way around it. I'm sure there is a way around it. We just didn't go any further than that. And then history length upon entrance and exit. So if you say, ask the user's browser, what's your history length? They go through the SSL flow, and then you ask it again at the end, you know how many pages. You just take the difference between those two numbers, you know how many pages they visited as they went through that flow. So if there's a very specific way to get through this flow and it takes this many pages, you know that they must have gone through that flow. That'll come up again later too. So this is my slide of fail. None of this worked. It sort of worked, but we're thinking about ways to